while we don't know this for sure until something like it happens, do you ultimately expect that there will be some form of central bank or government induced revaluation at some point? Well, hello there, my friends. Chris Marcus here with you for Arcadia Economics. And in today's show, we are going to be digging into something that I think is becoming more relevant, especially in the midst of talk of price controls, dollar devaluation, a potential strategic Bitcoin fund that would be partially funded by revaluing gold certificates. And along those lines, Bill Holter joining me, and certainly him and Jim Sinclair have previously talked about how they thought this could ultimately play out. So we'll talk about devaluations, revaluations, some increasing cost in the silver mining side, and a whole bunch of other things. So welcome on in, everyone, and welcome on in, Bill Holter. It's great to see you, my old friend. Nice to have you back on here. How are you today?
Good. Thanks for having me back.
Well, Bill, we're in mid-August, approaching late August. We have still not had the rate cuts that were forecast at the beginning of the year, although sure seems like we're getting closer to that. And especially as we get closer to the election, we're seeing some of the rhetoric is getting a little heated up. Again, as I know you're aware, JD Vance, who's been added to Trump's team, has previously talked about a dollar devaluation. Other day, we heard some proposals from Kamala Harris, which I can only imagine how excited you were to hear about housing subsidies and price controls. So a lot of tinkering with pricing and talk of devaluation. Also, at the same time, we did have that Bitcoin proposal. So, anything you could start with there in terms of where we stand in unusual environment, and then I'll have some questions from there.
Yeah, I'll start with the price controls Kamala Harris is talking about because that's the easiest one. Uh, Price controls have never, ever, ever worked in all of history. It's basically communism. And what happens is once you put uh, price controls in, you start to get inflation. And once the cost of making something goes above the cost that you can sell that item for, it doesn't get produced anymore. So price controls will only lead to supply shortages. I mean, that's what it's always done, and that's what it always will do. JD Vance devaluing the dollar. I mean, that's a short-term fix. It's basically admitting that you lost the war or lost the battle. Um, and devaluing the dollar, uh, I mean, there's many different facets to it, but it is definitely inflationary, and it definitely will hurt the central banks that hold treasuries as reserves because those will immediately go down overnight as soon as the devaluation starts. And uh, once you have countries at this point, for the last several years, have been accumulating gold at the fastest pace, in recent history. And the reason being, they understand that there's going to be either a dollar devaluation or a dollar implosion. So what they're doing is they're filling their balance sheet up with gold. It will naturally get revalued higher when the value of the dollar drops because if it takes more dollars to buy a cup of coffee, it's going to take more dollars to buy an ounce of gold. And as far as the Bitcoin thing is concerned, they're talking about borrowing off of the supposed gold that we have, 8,300 tons or whatever. It hasn't been audited since the 1950s. But assuming we do have the 8,300 tons, then what if they revalue that gold from $42 an ounce and they revalue it to 2,500? That's going to raise somewhere around $600 billion. And the proposal is to buy Bitcoin. So you're gonna encumber all the gold that's supposedly there, and I don't believe it is. But you'll encumber all of that gold, and they're going to put that money into Bitcoin. So they're going to take 600 billion and hopefully pay off 35 trillion now. A year from now, it'll be 37, 38. I mean, that number is going up a trillion every 100 days. Now, I don't know when, 6 months from now, a year, 5 years, whatever. Um, Hopefully, we don't find out that Bitcoin is nothing but digital air, and it's just a perfect accounting system of digital nothings. Because if that's the case, then we pissed our entire gold reserve down the drain into something that's worthless. And that is my personal opinion, that these digital currencies, um, we're going to find out that they are digital air.
Okay, that will certainly will be interesting to see how a lot of things respond, especially with some of the
Right.
things we see coming our way. Now, with all that said, Bill, perhaps the takeaway to me from the this Bitcoin strategic fund and Fed gold reserve certificates shows that they're aware of it. I mean, I hope that wouldn't come as a surprise, but we've heard other central banks in Germany and the Netherlands, some of their central bankers made interesting comments. No one, there hasn't been, obviously, there hasn't been a formal announcement, but while we don't know this for sure until something like it happens, do you ultimately expect that there will be some form of central bank or government induced revaluation at some point?
There has to be. There has to be because the fiat is going to collapse, which means the debt structure collapses. They have to have uh, the gold that's on their books. They're going to have to revalue higher to fill up the holes that are created by defaulted or much discounted treasuries of various sovereign countries.
Okay, and perhaps if you could add on to that, some of the things that you and Jim Sinclair had talked about. I know he had some particular structures in multiple stages of how he thought it was going to happen. And as you're answering that, if you can distinguish between the stuff he was speculating, or was there this was based on that revealing confidential source, but the context of the information.
Yeah, no, I mean, he heard things, and basically, in the end, it was a speculation. And he thought that gold would be revalued higher by governments during the first reset. And that really doesn't do anything because it does not eradicate fiat. And even a central bank digital currency is still fiat. So once that fails, and he didn't think it would take much more than maybe six months to a year to see uh, that fiat system fail, then you would have the real reset where derivatives across the board fail and all assets reset versus each other to true clearing prices. And
Okay.
if you go back, I mean, this was 5 or 6 years ago. He was talking about $50,000 gold, and I pointed out to him that just to cover the on books U.S. debt at the time, like I said, this was say 4 years ago, um, the number had to be 125,000 ounce.
And Bill,
And that's assuming again that we do have that gold. I don't assume that.
okay, and it seems like we're approaching somewhat of an environment much like what you're describing there, because you and I have been talking about this really since shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. There was a lot of talk for a long time about they don't like the dollar, they don't think it's a good system. We had the temporary gold backing, and then there's been things that have come out, speculation, although earlier this year, Pepe Escobar and others were reporting that now things are taking the next step forward. And we hear that something where there's a white paper for something called the unit, which Sergei Glaziev has talked about. And then Pepe Escobar reporting a couple of months ago, unit has already received backing by the BRICS Business Council on the roadmap for the October meeting. And then a month later, he reported Putin had a special meeting with the president of the BRICS New Development Bank, and they did talk about the bank's unit plan. So Again, here we have the 40% gold backing. So is this perhaps the fit in with what you and Jim are imagining might be the type of way that something like that could unfold?
Well, yeah, I mean, what you've got, the BRICS basically were formed because that group of nations wants free and fair and honest settlement. And the way it has been is that they ship real goods to the United States and we ship them dollars. The dollars are basically nothings because the Treasury and the Fed can print unlimited amounts of dollars to make payment so they don't default, but they have no value. So yeah, I mean that's why the BRICS originally that's why it started because you had nations that wanted to move away from the dollar. And if you go back to October of last year, you had gold at $1,700 an ounce. Now it's over 2,500. So that's almost a 50% move. And that move started one day after the US said that they were going to confiscate the $300 billion of Russian treasuries. You had, I mean, you got nations all over the world looking at Russia as the strongest military, thinking, well, hey, if they can do that to Russia, they can do that to us. So that's why they're scrambling to gold.
Yeah, and Bill, in there, you mentioned the confiscation of the assets. We talked about this 2 years ago, not trying to brag about being right, although I'll say you were right. I was just tagging along for the ride. I'll give you the credit where we were worried about you have, I mean, and that was right at the time period where the record central bank gold buying began. Now we had
Right.
Russia respond with some of their own sanctions a couple months earlier. And then something that I didn't hear many other people mention, but this was about a month ago, US banks to begin reporting Russian assets for eventual forfeiture under the new law. So the Treasury, which could de facto be the president, because this came out shortly after Biden allegedly signed that memo giving power over half the power over to Janet Yellen, but you see start disclosing Russian assets for eventual forfeiture. It seems like regardless of whether you what one thinks should be done with those assets, not going to be received well by Putin. And it's almost like every red line you see there, it's still like jamming it in your face and escalating towards a less ideal outcome for humans just trying to live on planet Earth.
Well, I mean, that is an exact example of the United States as a banana republic. I mean, mathematically, from a financial standpoint, the U.S. is broke. I mean, we're way past 100% debt to GDP. That article right there shows, from a judicial standpoint, we are a banana republic and do not recognize the rule of law unless it fits our narrative.
Yeah, certainly not an ideal trend in the midst of a lot of things that aren't so ideal, especially I am amazed how here we are, we're August 21st. I've stopped checking the FBI's website for any updates on the Trump assassination attempt. And strange that we're a
Comment.
couple of months away from the election. One person's been shot at. There's a lot of questions, shall we say, and not getting much resolution there. But anyway, Bill, there is something else that I would very much like to ask you because you've talked about central banks that are buying gold. To my knowledge, I have not heard of any central banks buying silver. And it feels to me, and you tell me if you see it differently, but it's at this point, if you compare today to where we were 5 years ago, 5 years ago, there were people like you and I talking about gold and silver, but it was more at that time saying this is what we think will happen at some point in the future. Now, based on some of the things we've already discussed here, I think you're starting to see a shift towards more actively invoking gold in the system. Now it's out of the planning stage. There's whether we're going to a revaluation or anything else, there's clearly a new level of where we're at. So it's changed the perception of gold in a bigger sense over the past 5 years. And I wonder, in the same way that people were looking at gold differently then, maybe gold goes first. At some point, do we start seeing money go into silver? Because in my long question here, what I'm getting at, here are the World Gold Council. This is the demand stats. You see the central banks in the pink, and these green bars here are investment. So if you add pink and green together, that's central bank plus other investment came to about 2,000 tons, a little bit over in 2022, right about 2,000 tons 2023. And they just set a first half record for 2024. So if you call it an average $2,000 gold price, to keep it simple, that comes out to $128 billion of investment went in there. Bill, would you care to venture a guess what the number, the investment dollar figure for silver would be?
Well, from official sources, it's probably very close to zero because they understand how small that market is. You're only talking about a $20 billion market. That's global production roughly. So a country wants to move in with a billion or $2 billion to buy silver, they blow up the supply and demand equilibrium. So I mean,
Yeah.
they would basically shoot themselves in the foot. There's no room for them to come in, and I can't read it. It's too small on my screen. Um, but what's not being talked about, or what's not even really being fully reported, is how much silver has been used and is being used in solar and green applications. I mean, that's way more than what the Silver Institute talks about. And I mean, they have to do that to show that, the deficit's not as big as it really is.
Yes, I think there's certainly a good case to be made that the solar panel numbers could be a bit higher. Just taking on the surface, just so we have a number to work with here, they list 243 million ounces of investment. So that's total investment, not just official sources. So at a $25 silver price, basically it was 5.8 billion in silver versus 128 billion in gold.
Right.
So again, we have not seen central banks look at silver yet, but interesting the scale between the two. And Bill, do you have any updated thoughts on when we get to the point where you start seeing that number in silver investment start to significantly grow larger, which is perhaps the thing that stood
Well,
between the money printing and having a longer lasting higher price between 2011 and now, and what I would think would ultimately be required?
that would require time, and I don't think we have time. First off, I'm on the record saying I think there's less than a 50-50 chance that we even have an election here in the US. I don't think there's a lot of time that even if we have an election, that the market holds together and does not collapse. And I think when all is said and done, I've been adamant about this for 10 years now, when all is said and done, silver is going to blow up and blow up the entire derivatives complex by a failure to deliver. Because you've got so much naked paper out there, and at some point in time, an event will happen, and it may not even be an event. It may be just one wealthy individual who says, before he gets the tap on the shoulder saying, don't do it, he puts an order for 5 billion in and blows the entire market up because he says, I want it delivered. So there's going to be a failure to deliver, and it will start, in my opinion, in silver.
Well, that could well be the case. And something I was just watching right before we started recording here, great interview with Chris Ritchie, who runs Silvercrest. And we won't play the highlights here. Highly recommended, worth checking out. You go to the Sprott Money channel, Why Price is Set to Explode from Chris Ritchie. Although some of the things he mentioned were, A, when all of the costs are added in, not just the all-in sustaining, but cost of the land, developing the project, putting the mine there, building the processing plant. He said when you put all of those together, add in inflation, and then divide by a number of ounces, that they're already at $25 plus. I've seen similar figures estimated for several of the other miners. In addition to that, he also mentioned how they're continuing to withhold metal from the market because they think the price is artificially low and it's not in their best economic incentives. They're doing that. First Majestic has done that at different points. Endeavor Silver has done that at different points. So I know there's some people who have different views on whether they want their companies to do that or not, but to the degree that they are doing it, we're seeing a cost go up, the supply being withheld at current pricing. How likely do you think it is that? I mean, I try to keep things balanced. There's certainly at the current pace we're at, and with the time lag of how long it would take to bring some new projects online, I don't want to go out saying, oh, we're in the middle of a shortage, because we're not in a shortage now. We're in a deficit now, I would say, and try to be clear with those things. But there's some sense in which you could look and say seems like we're headed to it. With it's harder to find a way maybe where you don't get there. Obviously, there is a fair amount of retail held silver that's been purchased over the past 10 years for estimates of around 3 billion ounces or so, which we've seen a lot of that being sold. But any thoughts on any of that, and whether we are headed to a gap at some point?
Yeah, I mean, even if you didn't have companies withholding production, the total global production has basically peaked, and there's no huge projects out there that they know they're going to be able to start mining in 5 to 10 years. That's going to blow up the supply, really build that supply. So supply is definitely constrained. And I do want to mention to you, Chris, and you might be able to fact check this, but 10 years ago, I wrote an article talking about companies withholding production. And I'm going to guess it was maybe 2 months after I wrote that article, First Majestic announced that they were going to withhold production. And I was at a conference and I went over to the First Majestic table and I asked them, I said, why did they decide to withhold production? They said, the board read an article. I can only assume that that was mine, because I was pretty adamant that if you're actually losing money on every ounce that you sell, why would you sell it? Why wouldn't you just stockpile it? Why wouldn't you just sell enough to cover your operating expenses? And I think more and more companies are going to do that, and that will cut the supply more and more.
Yeah, well, it's certainly something that, and again, I'd really recommend to people to watch that interview, because some good comments from Chris there, and maybe we'll see if we can round him up and get him on here. And either case, anyway, it was a pleasure to have you in here today, Bill, and always fun to catch up. And if there's anything else on your mind that we did not cover today, or perhaps if you'd like to tell people where to find you on the website and how to reach you.
You can go to my website. It's BHOLTER at proton.me. I mean, that's my website, or my email. My website is billholter.com.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. I know people always love hearing from you, and it's always great to see that you're writing out there, especially as things are heating up. And any final predictions between now? Why don't we make it a plan that we will catch up again before the end of 2024? But since we're in late August, aside from the Jets, New York Jets at that point being sailing along to the #1 seed, probably an undefeated season before capturing the Super Bowl, but any election, silver, sports, pop culture, musical predictions
Well,
for the end of
you just
2024?
blew the whole interview. Nobody wants to hear dreaming.
Oh, come on, come on. Well, in either case, we'll make sure to do this again before the end of the year, and always great to see you.
Yeah, or
And
maybe before the election,
okay. Well, we're coming up right around the
if
corner,
there
Bill.
is.
So thanks again
Very,
for being here, and we will pick it up then.
very good. Look forward to it.
Well, thank you to Bill for today's call. Always fun to catch up with Bill. And I know some people sometimes say, well, he's been saying some of these things for a long time, and especially with gold setting new all-time highs, and in the context of what is coming down the road, I think it's safe to say that he has now been right about a lot of these things. So in either case, grateful for Bill joining us. And before we wrap up, would also like to thank Silver Viper Minerals, who is a sponsor to the show here. And obviously the big challenge for Silver Viper has been to get their drilling program ongoing. which has been difficult in the current financing environment. But we did catch up with Steve Cope recently, and to get an update of the latest of where things stand, well, that video is coming your way here.